Hello and welcome to episode 75 of React Native Radio. Today on our panel we have Peter Pikarczyk.
Hey everybody.
I'm your host Nader Dabbit, and our special guest today is Doug Lowder from Salesforce, here to talk about React Native with AppleTV. Welcome to the show, Doug.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I met you briefly at the Chain React Conf, and you had done a nice presentation there on Apple TV with React Native, and that's a topic that we've never covered here on the show, so we're pretty excited to talk about it. But I guess before we get into the actual topic, we normally like to do a quick intro for our guests. Can you give us an intro about yourself, kind of talking about how you got into programming and how you ended up working on React Native?
Absolutely. Well, how I got into programming, probably a little bit unusual for many of your listeners. I got into programming on mainframes with punch cards because that's just a function of my age. I had a previous career as a research scientist at UC Berkeley. I was studying astrophysics. And as a part of that work, I learned how to write computer code in various languages, Fortran, C. And in about the year 2000, I made the switch to the private sector and started the career path that I'm on now. And here I am today. I'm actually very happy. I've been at Salesforce for the last 3 years. I work on the Salesforce core application, and I work on various mobile software at Salesforce. And part of that work was the React Native work on Apple TV.
So can you kind of give us a introduction to how Apple TV and React Native became a thing? Who started working on it, and how did it come about, I guess?
Yes, the group that I was in at Salesforce last year became interested in looking at the possibility of building applications for Apple TV. This was for our customers, and the applications would use Salesforce APIs. And one of the interesting things about Apple TV is that web technologies don't work. The Apple TV doesn't have any web views. It doesn't have a browser. So if you're, as many other companies, Salesforce is very focused on web technologies. So in order for us to use web technologies or JavaScript, we had to find a framework that would allow us to use those technologies on Apple TV. And there are a couple of options, but we did some research and found that we thought React Native would be the best option. React Native, there was already some React Native work going on at Salesforce. React Native is actually a supported platform for the Salesforce mobile SDK, which we provide to customers who want to build their own applications. So as a result of this research and development project, basically, I became the person who ported React Native all by myself to Apple TV. And we decided that rather than keep our own repo, our own fork repo, it would be better to have this fully integrated with the Facebook master repo. So I began work late last year towards doing that. And as of now, as of about React Native version 0.46, 0.47, I'd say it's feature complete. There are still a couple of issues. However, I have I think for all the issues, I have either pull requests actually merged or ready to be merged.
Wow, that is just really, really cool. I have to be honest. I haven't really heard much about this project, so there's a lot to talk about there. So when you say it's feature complete, so someone can literally create a new React Native project and build an app for the Apple TV like today?
That is correct. So if you, for example, the standard way of creating a React Native app is to do React Native init, right? If you do that, you will get an Xcode project that supports both iOS and Apple TV today.
Yeah, I've noticed that those projects have been there lately. I don't know exactly what version they came about, but yeah, I definitely noticed that.
Right. So that I think that came in like 2 or 3 releases back. In any case, my intention was that a person would be able to have the same React Native code, same JavaScript code work without any changes or with as few changes as possible on both Apple TV and iOS. So a lot of the same APIs are used. Some of the same native iOS APIs can be used. There are many APIs that cannot be used. We can go into them in a little bit if you want. But the ones that do work on Apple TV should work the same as they do on iOS, with a couple of exceptions.
What about styling and even maybe? So I guess before I jump ahead into styling, would you ever be in a situation where you'd release the same app with the same code base for both Apple TV and iPhone, for example?
I did actually try that. We at one of the demonstration applications that we showcased at Salesforce's annual conference. It's called Dreamhouse. Basically, it's a small app that would be targeted at a real estate business and uses custom Salesforce objects. And there's a React Native version of this app that some of our mobile SDK developers built. And I actually was able to make that work on Apple TV. Most of the files were exactly identical, with one exception. The top level file basically had a pivot between Apple TV that changed the styling a bit and changed the way navigation worked, because standard navigation patterns on iOS aren't really suited for Apple TV. But with that one exception, all of the rest of the code is identical.
Oh, wow. So what was that experience like building for you? Do you feel like you went against the grain a lot of the time, or did it feel natural, It felt pretty natural. One of the nice things about React Native is that it has this nice Flexbox layout. So a lot of things just lay themselves out correctly, even in a screen that's larger or a form factor that's different. That all just works out of the box. One thing you do have to remember on Apple TV is that it's a much bigger screen, and therefore, if you want text and other features to be visible, you have to make them larger. So you definitely want to have your styling be Apple TV specific, to answer your earlier question.
So you're working with font size 120? Crazy
yeah,
stuff like that.
You typically, the smallest font size you'd probably want for a typical React Native app on TV is probably 30 or 40. And if you want things to really be big and show up, probably 100 or maybe even higher, depending on exactly what it is. So, but with those changes, everything looks very nice.
So is this project, I'm sure this wasn't just JavaScript. I'm kind of curious, what languages did you have to use to integrate all this stuff together? And how much JavaScript were you writing before this versus how much that you're kind of had to learn to do this and how much you're writing now?
Okay. So I came at React Native from the point of view of an iOS native developer. I definitely had quite a bit of JavaScript experience because that's what we use to write a lot of the code for the Salesforce core application that runs on Salesforce servers. That being said, the work that I did for this port was what I would say was about probably 60% native code changes and 40% JavaScript changes. So if you want to get into the technical details, I'll just try to explain them very briefly. Some of them are actually covered in the React Native master documentation. If you look at the React Native documentation that's part of the Facebook GitHub site, you'll see that there's a new page that's appeared for the last couple of releases called Building for Apple TV, and it goes through a lot of these technical details. But I'll try to cover them very briefly here. So the first change that I made was there's a native class that implements the basic view class for React Native called RCT View, and I made an Apple TV special version of that. And the reason I did that was because the views, the UI views in Apple TV have to handle what's called the Apple TV Focus Engine. When you interact with the Apple TV, there's no touch screen. All you have is the remote the root has a little trackpad. The trackpad basically detects swipes up, down, left, and right, and based on what the user does, will navigate from one focusable view to the next focusable view. It's basically like tab. It's a little bit like tab navigation on the web. And so the first change I made was to enable the React View class to be able to handle correctly those focus engine changes, to know when a view is coming into focus, when it comes out of focus, and to decide, in fact, which views are focusable. And generally, for example, in general, this is generalization, but views should only be focusable if you plan to interact with them in some way. So, for example, in the case of React Native, the views that are focusable are mostly touchable things like touchable highlight, touchable opacity. And I built everything so that when a view comes into focus, methods in the touchable mix-in would work and highlight the view. And then when the user presses the select button on the remote, it would be the same as if the user pressed the button on iOS with their finger. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, that definitely is pretty interesting how you had to kind of think about this, I guess, going about it just a completely different way, right? You're
That's
basically
correct.
abstracting, something that normally wouldn't fit together to make it fit together, right?
That's correct. And the challenge was to do this without having to have basically a whole different set of components for Apple TV. Because I didn't want users to have to completely rewrite all their code completely differently for Apple TV if it was possible to do it that way. And it turned out it is possible to do it that way. So that was one big change. A lot of the rest of the code works basically the same on iOS as it does on Apple TV. There's a lot of areas of the code where I didn't have to make any changes at all. I think if that were not the case, it would be much more than a one-person job to do this port. One of the other things that I did was to build in some support for custom event handling. So for developers that wanted to have more complex handling of events coming from the remote, so the developer might want to know if the person was going left, right, up, or down, pressing the menu button, pressing the play pause button. So I built in an event emitter specifically just for that. And there's instructions in this documentation on the React Native repo on how to actually add that support to your component.
Oh, nice.
What about buttons like Siri and volume? Is that something that your app consumes, or is that outside of the outside of the React Native ecosystem and more on the, iOS side?
There's no direct React Native support for Siri. For the volume controls, I don't think that the core React Native code does anything particular with sound APIs. I believe there's some separate repos that try to add sound support to React Native, and I haven't actually spent any time trying to build in Apple TV, any special Apple TV support on those repos.
Okay, cool.
There is one place where Siri definitely does work. The text input component in React Native is fully supported on Apple TV. If you select it, you will actually get the text input, and the text input, if I remember correctly, actually support Siri voice input. That's just built into the OS. I didn't have to do anything to make that work.
And that, for anybody listening, is like a lifesaver, because I just had to type in my password on my Apple TV yesterday, actually, and I've got 30 character passwords, and trying to use that remote to type it in would have been a nightmare. And it was, before I realized that there's a way to do it through voice.
I agree with you, and I've found a Bluetooth keyboard to be very useful on Apple TVs as well.
Oh, that's a good idea. I have another question for you pertaining about workflows. Do you think there's any opportunity to be able to build apps in tandem, where, let's say, you've got an app open on your phone that is communicating to the TV. You know, for example, maybe you use your phone as a controller for a game that you're playing on your TV. Are any of those like capabilities, or I guess like, do you think something like that is possible with React Native TV and just for iOS?
Yes, it definitely is possible. There is, unfortunately, I don't remember the name of the framework, but Apple actually, as of iOS 10, provided a special framework just for that kind of communication. And it works across between iOS and Apple TV devices. I haven't built any React Native support for that API, but that certainly could be done. There already is a remote application that's shipped by Apple that you can download from the App Store that basically does everything that the Siri remote does on your phone. So if you like lose track of your remote, you can download that application on your iOS phone, and you'll have a remote for your Apple TV.
Oh, that's really cool. I didn't know that. I wonder if that includes a keyboard as well.
It does.
Yeah,
Oh, that's
I think
awesome.
I've
That's
used
good to
that. It
know.
does have the keyboard. So for people that have never programmed for Apple TV in general, can you kind of talk about the differences between just normal iOS programming for like an iPhone versus native programming for like an Apple TV? Like, are there, I guess the languages are the same. Is it still going to be Objective-C and Swift? And other than that, what are the differences?
Okay, so it's exactly the same. The programming environment is still Xcode. The language is still Objective-C or Swift, depending on your preference. And the programming environment is basically identical. If you're a iOS developer, you can ramp up very quickly on Apple TV. So the differences are the focus engine. You have to learn about how that works. You have to learn about which APIs are not supported on Apple TV. For example, web views, as I mentioned before, no sliders, no switches, no status bar. So any code that uses those things tends to not work or crash if you try to use them on Apple TV. So you only have to be aware of all those things. I did actually add in a flag in the platform component in React Native, platform.isTViOS, so that developers who needed to know if they're running on Apple TV or not can tell. But apart from these, missing APIs and the difference in input model, the programming environment is pretty much identical.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. That kind of tells me a lot as someone that's never really done this before. I guess another question I have though is, what type of apps are people developing for Apple TV? I mean, for me, I always, of course, I'm going to think about anything with media, videos and music and that type of stuff. But in general, is that kind of the main type of app that people are building? And can you kind of talk about that, I guess, in a little bit?
Some of this is going to be, my personal opinion, but I've done a little bit of searching around in this area to try to find out what kind of apps people are building. And typically one of them is media, obviously, because that's what it's optimized for. One is games. There's a lot of games built for Apple TV. Apple TV, React Native doesn't have any specific support for this yet, but the Apple TV supports various types of game controllers that look very much like the game controllers you'd see on an Xbox or PlayStation. And so that's a second category of apps. A third one would be, I think it's extremely good for large data displays. And this is something that I'm hoping to see more applications take advantage of. The phone screen real estate is really too small for really good detailed data displays, but the Apple TV is great for it. It's got a huge amount of real estate. So for me, things, data visualization frameworks should be looking at this platform. Another application category that you see a lot of and that you might see more of in the future is shopping applications. there was a talk at Chain React about trying to integrate, for example, PayPal APIs with React Native apps just to make people's shopping experience easier. The fact that React Native works on Apple TV may make it possible for them to do that work on Apple TV, since Apple TV doesn't have any web views. So if you have a web-based flow for something like this, that's not going to work on Apple TV without support of something like React Native.
That's pretty interesting. I haven't really thought of that. I guess that makes sense. People sitting at home, just kind of browsing through their apps, they can just jump on and start shopping, I guess.
That they can.
So another thing that is super interesting about this conversation is the fact that Salesforce is kind of contributing so much to the React Native ecosystem by, having this project and you contributing, of course, building this stuff out. I'm kind of curious though, what else is React Native specific going on with Salesforce? Or I guess better worded, like what else is Salesforce doing with React Native? I know Salesforce is just a massive company and there's probably a million things going on, but I'd be interested to know if you kind of had any info about that.
There is, as I said, as I said before, Salesforce has what's called their mobile SDK. So we provide basically Salesforce APIs, code for Salesforce APIs that our customers can use to develop their own applications. So what you get if you're a Salesforce customer is you get for free our mobile SDK, which has code for authentication to Salesforce, for all of these Salesforce REST APIs, and for caching on the device, for synchronization, and a lot of other things. And we provide this in various formats. We provide it for people who want to build the application completely natively. We provide it for people who want to build WebView or Cordova-based applications. And we also, we would call hybrid applications. And then we also provide it for people who want to build React Native applications. So that's one very large piece of React Native activity that we have at Salesforce. In addition, of course, Salesforce is building a few React Native apps of their own. I can't talk about them specifically right now because most of them are still in development and are not in production yet. But once they are in production, I'd be very happy to talk about them.
Awesome. That's super cool. I'm looking forward to kind of hearing about that in the future. So when you say that Salesforce has a mobile SDK, is it like a React Native specific mobile SDK for Salesforce?
That's correct. We have one of the flavors of our mobile SDK is specifically for React Native. So we have React Native components that wrap our authentication APIs and that wrap our Salesforce REST APIs.
So I guess if someone wanted to kind of build an application that integrates with Salesforce, they would go use that. Is that normally a business to business type of application, or can developers kind of just decide to build maybe a free app or maybe a for-profit app and kind of use the SDK for people not too familiar with Salesforce? Because to be completely honest, I've heard Salesforce and I kind of know what it does, but I've never actually done anything with it. I've never been in a situation where I've had to build or integrate with any sort of Salesforce APIs.
What I would suggest is probably the best way to get started as a developer is to go to our website, developer.salesforce.com, that talks a little bit about how to get started. You can actually have a developer Salesforce account, so you can actually see how Salesforce works. And it should allow you to do things like download the mobile SDK and start playing around with them.
So we've covered quite a bit. We'll probably wrap it up here shortly, but before we do that, Doug or Peter, is there anything that we haven't really gone over that you'd like to talk about?
I think that covers a lot of my questions. I was just thinking about how I could use this for like building out some cool gaming experiences, for my TV. But the big questions on my list have been checked off. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. there's definitely still some work that is yet to be done on Apple TV. Certainly, we'd like to get one of the nice things that we'd like to have is game controller support for people who want to actually start thinking about basing games on React Native. I've already got CocoaPod support for users who use that for their dependency management on iOS. That actually works for Apple TV as well now. Another thing that people have asked about, and which I'd really like to do, but it's a big job, is support for Expo. Many listeners may know about the Expo project, which supports iOS and Android. It'd be nice for that to support Apple TV as well. One of the problems I'm working on now is to how to surface touch events from the Apple TV remote in a way that the developer could use them directly instead of just using like left, right, or up, down gestures. And that's turned out to be very interesting, but it seems to be, at least partially working already. So I'm very excited about that.
So that just made me think of another question. When you're kind of building for Apple TV, do you have like an Apple TV simulator? And then what if you want to then test it on like a device? Do you just like plug it up to your Samsung TV on your wall, or how does that work?
Well, you have to use an Apple TV, not a, I see, Samsung actual television.
Okay, yeah. So I guess you would upload it to the Apple TV, like to the App Store or something like that, for the test flight?
So if you want to, this works the same as the iOS development model. You have to have a developer account with Apple in order to test on devices. So most of my work I try to do on the simulator as much as possible because it saves a lot of time. But for testing on a device, yes, you can buy an Apple TV and you get a USB to USB-C cable, and it plugs right into the back of the Apple TV, and you do basically the same process that you would when you put development code on an iPhone. It works exactly the same way.
Okay, cool. So,
for example, at the Chain React conference, I showed a video of the talk I built for the conference, which was a React Native app, actually running on a real Apple TV in my hotel room, which is pretty fun.
Well, I think after this podcast, I'm going to be inspired to kind of build something with this. I will definitely reach out if I have any problems and ask you some questions for sure.
Absolutely. I'm very happy to hear about people trying to build applications. And if you run into any issues, you can create issues on GitHub, or you can send me messages. My Twitter is Doug Lowder. And I look forward to hearing about all the awesome applications that people get to build with this technology.
So I guess we can go ahead and jump to the picks. Peter, do you have any picks?
My pick is the GraphQL Apollo documentation, which I've been using every single day for the past couple of weeks. It's been very well documented and has a lot of great recipes. And even if you're a GraphQL beginner, it offers a lot of fantastic resources for getting started and then figuring out things that you really want to do. They expand more than just past your typical to-do app, which has been refreshing because we don't just all build to-do apps. So I had to give them a shout out.
Doug, do you have any picks tonight?
My pick is the Victory Native framework built by Formidable Labs, which I've been playing with as part of my work on surfacing touch events on the Apple TV. It's a really great data visualization framework on the web, and it also works extremely well in React Native, both for iOS and for Apple TV. So I've been really impressed with it and having a lot of fun with it.
Awesome. Yeah, that's been such a much needed thing, and that is a great framework that they've built. I played with it a little bit, but I've yet to have an opportunity to use it in production. But yeah, it's awesome. My pick is a course that's been released by Jason Brown called Master React Native Animations. Jason has been doing React Native animations since really as far as I can remember. We had him on our show like almost 2 years ago to talk about animations. So here, 2 years later, he's still been kind of mastering his skills, and he's put out a course, and it's a really, really detailed and intricate course. Like if you can get through this, you'll be able to pretty much do any type of animations. So it's totally worth it. And I think you can either sign up for just for yourself, or you can sign up for your company at like a discount. And the URL is reactnativeanimations.com. Definitely check it out if you get a chance. All right. Well, Doug, thanks for taking the time out of your schedule to join us and coming on the show. We really appreciate having you on.
I appreciate you inviting me. This has been extremely fun, and I look forward to future podcasts from you. I've heard a couple of them already, and they've been really great. I hope mine comes up to that level.
Definitely. No, this one's been really good. What if someone wants to kind of reach out to you or follow you on Twitter? Like, what are some of your social handles?
Twitter is just Doug Lowder, DougLowder. And I'm also on Facebook, but probably the easiest place to reach me would be on Twitter. My email, my personal email, if people want to send me a direct email about this, is DougLowder@mac.com.
Okay, great. Well, that wraps up episode 75. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next week.